A line was crossed. A relationship once considered the most stable, predictable, and dependable economic partnership on Earth fractured, perhaps permanently. This isn't a story about some obscure trade skirmish buried on the business pages. It's not a technical dispute you can safely ignore. This is a story about your job, about the price of your next car, about whether factories stay open or go dark across an entire continent. It's about economic security, political trust, and how quickly decades of cooperation can unravel when power is wielded carelessly. This is the story of how a quiet, simmering trade disagreement, one that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years, suddenly erupted into a full-blown economic firestorm. A firestorm ignited by a single decision made in Washington, a move intended to project strength, confidence, and control. Instead, it triggered a devastatingly precise counterstrike from Canada, one so calculated and unexpected that it sent shockwaves through Wall Street and carved a multi-billion-dollar crater into the heart of North American industry. To understand just how dramatic this rupture was, picture the North American steel industry on February 9, 2025. It wasn't fragile. It wasn't divided. It was a finely tuned, deeply integrated machine, one of the most efficient industrial ecosystems ever built. Steelworkers in Ohio and steelworkers in Ontario weren't competitors in any meaningful sense. They were part of the same system, feeding the same supply chains, supporting the same automakers, builders, and manufacturers. Their livelihoods were intertwined, their success mutually dependent. And then, overnight, that reality vanished. By the next morning, a single announcement from the White House didn't just tweak the rules of trade, it picked up the rulebook, shredded it, and set it on fire. Colleagues were recast as rivals, partners were recategorized as threats, cooperation gave way to confrontation. This is the story of how a calculated protectionist move by the United States, designed to shield its domestic steel industry, backfired spectacularly. How it triggered a Canadian response that put more than $12 billion of American steel exports directly in the crosshairs, and how the world's friendliest, most integrated trade relationship devolved into a bare-knuckle economic brawl. So how did it all begin? The breaking point arrived on February 10, 2025. On that day, the U.S. administration announced it was not only reinstating but dramatically expanding the controversial Section 232 tariffs. What had once been a targeted policy became a sweeping one, a blanket 25% tariff on all steel imports from every country on Earth. Crucially, this new version eliminated all country-specific exemptions. For years, close allies, especially Canada, had been shielded from the harshest effects of American protectionism. That shield vanished without warning. As of March 12, 2025, Canadian steel would be treated no differently than steel from anywhere else in the world. At the border, it became a foreign commodity, subject to a heavy tax. The logic coming out of Washington was blunt and uncompromising. American jobs must be protected, domestic production must be boosted, and the cost, whatever it might be, was worth paying. Initially, Wall Street seemed to agree. Shares of major U.S. steelmakers surged. Investors rushed in, anticipating massive gains. With foreign competitors suddenly saddled with a 25% price disadvantage, American producers appeared poised to dominate their home market. For a brief moment, it looked like a decisive victory, a bold move that paid off instantly. But this triumph ignored a reality that couldn't be wished away. Canada isn't just another trading partner. It is the single largest buyer of American exports. It is also one of the top suppliers of the very steel and aluminum the U.S. economy depends on. The two economies are not merely connected, they are physically intertwined. Auto parts, steel beams, aluminum sheets, and specialized components cross the border multiple times during a single production cycle. Severing one link in this chain doesn't strengthen the system. It destabilizes it. While steel stocks rallied, something else happened quietly in the background. The broader market flinched. Major indices dipped. It wasn't a collapse, but it was a nervous shudder. Seasoned traders understood something the celebratory headlines missed. A trade war with your biggest customer and most integrated supplier isn't a war you win. It's a war you fight against yourself. And Canada wasn't going to absorb the blow quietly. For decades, Canada's response to American trade aggression had been restrained. Diplomatic protests, legal challenges, back-channel negotiations. This time was different. The sudden removal of its exemption, done without consultation, was seen in Ottawa not just as an economic move, but as a betrayal, a violation of trust. And when the response came, it was immediate, overwhelming, and surgically precise. On March 13, 2025, just one day after the U.S. tariffs took effect, Canada unleashed its counterattack. Ottawa announced retaliatory tariffs on up to 29.8 billion Canadian dollars worth of American goods, roughly 20.7 billion US dollars. This wasn't random. It was a carefully engineered list designed to maximize pain. Automobiles, agricultural products, consumer goods, items chosen not only for economic impact, but for political sensitivity. At the center of it all was steel. Canada didn't just react, it struck. A blunt, unapologetic blow, a 25% tariff on $12.6 billion worth of American steel exports landed like a thunderclap across the border. Aluminum wasn't spared either. Another $3 billion hit with the same precision. The message, clear, sharp, and impossible to ignore. If the United States aimed at Canadian steel, Canada would return the fire, targeting the lifeblood of American exports. This wasn't a diplomatic nudge. This was a declaration of war on trade terms. American steel companies felt the shock immediately. The protections they enjoyed at home suddenly seemed fragile, almost laughable. Their domestic advantages couldn't shield them from the reality staring them in the face. Their largest foreign market had turned against them. What had once been a reliable source of revenue, Canada, was now hostile territory. Those early spikes in stock prices, the ones Wall Street had celebrated with fanfare, now looked more like a sugar rush. Exciting, brief, and ultimately unsustainable. Executives scrambled. Boardrooms across the U.S. buzzed with tension. Plans that assumed a stable Canadian market had to be rewritten overnight. Supply chains that had functioned smoothly for decades were suddenly exposed to risk. Every shipment, every contract, every forecast became a potential flashpoint. Investors began to murmur, analysts frowned, and a sense of unease crept into the market. Canada's move was methodical, almost surgical. It wasn't about creating chaos for chaos's sake. It was about leverage. By striking where it hurt, Canada sent a message that the era of one-sided trade bullying was over. The country was willing to defend its industries, its workers, and its economy. And it had the clout to make it count. For U.S. steel producers, the math was brutal. Higher tariffs meant higher costs, reduced demand, and lost market share. The ripple effects would be felt far beyond the factory floor. Any lingering hope that tensions might cool off dissolved as summer approached. Early optimism, maybe the dispute would settle, maybe a compromise could be reached, evaporated like mist in the sun. There were no quiet negotiations, no back-channel reconciliations. Every headline, every market report, every political statement underscored the reality. The trade war was real, and it was escalating. Across both sides of the border, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Steel and aluminum weren't just commodities, they were symbols of industrial power, employment, and national pride. Losing ground in these markets would hit more than balance sheets. It would hit communities, factories, and livelihoods. Canada understood this, and it wielded its leverage ruthlessly. For U.S. companies, the writing was on the wall. Protective tariffs at home offered comfort, but not salvation. Canada had shown that it could and would fight back. What had started as a warning from Washington now faced a counterpunch from Ottawa, and as the days passed, the markets adjusted. What looked like a temporary disruption began to feel like a permanent shift. By midsummer, the battle lines were drawn. The clash over steel and aluminum had moved from the trading floors into boardrooms, factories, and politics. Every shipment crossing the border carried more than metal. It carried tension, uncertainty, and the unmistakable weight of a trade war that was far from over. Instead of easing off, Washington slammed the pedal to the metal. On June 4, 2025, the United States dropped a bombshell. Tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum would leap from 25% to an almost unimaginable 50%. In the modern world of allied economies, numbers like that are almost unheard of. This wasn't a negotiating tactic. It wasn't a warning. A tariff this high doesn't discourage trade. It crushes it. It's economic warfare, pure and simple. For Canadian steel producers, the news hit like a gut punch. The stakes weren't abstract. They were existential. Plants across Ontario went into crisis mode, spreadsheets burning bright under fluorescent lights as executives tried to calculate the damage. How do you survive when half your revenue disappears at the border overnight? Every shipment facing an extra 50% levy meant lost contracts, strained suppliers, and mounting anxiety. Layoffs accelerated. Workers who had counted on steady paychecks for years suddenly found themselves in limbo. Entire towns, built around factories that had defined their identity for generations, felt the shock. Cafes, hardware stores, and local service businesses braced for a ripple effect that would echo long after the steel cooled. Families whispered about uncertainty at kitchen tables. Communities that once celebrated industrial pride now confronted harsh reality. Ottawa's response was swift and unflinching. Politicians condemned the move as overtly punitive, an attack not just on trade but on livelihoods. Behind closed doors, trade advisors and ministers strategized their next move. They weren't about to stand by while the economic foundations of their country were targeted. The message was clear. Canada had more cards to play, and it would use them. Meanwhile, the integrated supply chain that had defined North American manufacturing for decades began to fracture. Factories that relied on cross-border steel shipments faced delays, cost spikes, and sudden shortages. Assembly lines slowed. Contracts were renegotiated or canceled entirely. For decades, U.S. and Canadian industries had functioned like clockwork, a seamless machine humming across borders. Now, that machine was stuttering, sparking, breaking into jagged pieces. The tension wasn't just financial, it was deeply human. Communities that had grown around steel mills and aluminum plants were suddenly in economic freefall. Workers and executives alike faced sleepless nights, balancing loyalty, survival, and anger. Every shipment, every tariff notice, every government statement added to a sense of mounting crisis. In boardrooms from Toronto to Ottawa, leaders made calculations in real time. This wasn't about ideology, it was about survival. Each scenario was grim: lost revenue, shuttered plants, and a reshaped industrial landscape. And yet, even under this pressure, Canada's resolve hardened. The message was unmistakable. Economic intimidation would be met with strategy, precision, and determination. By mid-June, the scale of the confrontation was impossible to ignore. What started as a trade disagreement had escalated into a full-blown economic clash. Steel and aluminum were no longer mere commodities. They were weapons, leverage, and symbols of national strength. The battle had moved far beyond tariffs. It had reached the heart of communities, factories, and families. The question now hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Who would blink first? And when the dust settled, what would remain of the industries, jobs, and lives caught in the crossfire of one of the most aggressive trade battles in decades? The damage didn't stop at raw materials. Tariffs now applied to derivative products, creating a nightmare of cascading costs. A part made with Canadian steel, assembled in the U.S., shipped back to Canada, and then sold in the U.S. could be taxed multiple times along the way. Costs spiraled, profits collapsed. One economic analysis noted that corporate profits for U.S. fabricated metal manufacturers dropped by roughly 30% over the first half of 2025 alone. The strategy was simple: apply enough pressure until Canada folded. But Washington misjudged its neighbor. The escalation didn't break Canada's resolve, it hardened it, and then Ontario stepped in. As federal governments hurled billion-dollar blows back and forth, one player rose with unmistakable force: Ontario. The province that powered Canada's manufacturing heartland was suddenly center stage, and its stakes couldn't have been higher. Plants and factories that had defined the region for generations were under direct threat. Jobs, contracts, and entire communities hung in the balance. Ontario's premier didn't hesitate. This was high-stakes brinkmanship in action. Threats were issued with calculated precision. Economic levers, carefully hidden in bureaucratic drawers, were suddenly on display. Electricity exports were floated as potential bargaining chips. Government contracts, once routine instruments of public policy, were weaponized. Even nickel, a critical component in the booming electric vehicle market, entered the conversation as a strategic pressure point. The message was unmistakable. Ontario could hurt where it mattered most. Some of it was theater, designed to grab headlines and rattle opponents, but some of it was deadly serious. Every word, every threat, every calculation was weighed against the hard realities of supply chains, trade flows, and industrial survival. For U.S. industries, what might have looked like political posturing from across the border carried immediate economic implications. The dispute had outgrown the confines of policy documents and tariff announcements. It had become emotional, local, and politically combustible. Factory workers shared the tension with their families. Local officials watched every development like a storm on the horizon, knowing that a misstep could bring devastating fallout. Communities that had once thrived quietly in the shadow of assembly lines now found themselves on the front lines of an international confrontation. The escalation wasn't just vertical, from federal to provincial, but horizontal as well. State-level actors in the U.S. monitored Ontario's moves, calculating their own responses. What began as a trade spat between two national governments had evolved into a multi-front conflict involving municipal, provincial, and state-level actors. Every action triggered a counteraction. Every threat carried the weight of potential disruption. Containment was slipping away. The tension was palpable, almost tangible. Ontario's factories, steel mills, and aluminum plants weren't just production centers, they were symbols of resilience and leverage. Every decision made in Ottawa or Toronto sent shockwaves across the border. Supply chains strained under the uncertainty. Investors adjusted forecasts, cautious now in a market where headlines moved faster than reality could catch up. In this environment, strategy became survival. Ontario had learned a lesson from earlier Canadian federal responses. Standing still was not an option. To protect its economic core, the province had to act boldly, even if it meant stepping into uncharted territory. Each threat, each maneuver, served a dual purpose: to safeguard industry at home and to send an unmistakable signal to Washington. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere grew electric. Negotiations, both overt and covert, were laced with tension. Every announcement was scrutinized for hidden meaning. Every statement from provincial leaders carried the weight of potential escalation. The dispute had moved far beyond tariffs and trade statistics. It had become a story about identity, power, and survival. By the time the dust of this first provincial response began to settle, one thing was clear. This was no longer just a U.S.-Canada trade dispute. It was a multi-dimensional confrontation, layered with political, economic, and social complexity. The battleground had expanded, and every actor involved understood that the consequences of miscalculation could ripple for years. Ontario had made its presence known, and the world was watching. The message was as sharp as any tariff. If you think trade wars are abstract battles of numbers, think again. They touch people, communities, and the very heart of industry. And in this fight, Ontario was no bystander. It was a player willing to push limits, test boundaries, and make the consequences unmistakably real. And the economic pain was spreading. By late 2025, the data told a brutal story. Canadian steel production fell sharply, manufacturing employment dropped, emergency aid programs rolled out, but the U.S. wasn't spared. Downstream industries, autos, appliances, construction, were crushed by higher input costs. Vehicles became more expensive, profit margins evaporated, farmers were hit by targeted retaliation. This is the reality of trade wars. A narrow group benefits, everyone else pays. Then came Canada's quietest and smartest move. In late December 2025, Ottawa launched what can only be described as a winter offensive. New tariffs on steel derivatives from all countries, tighter quotas, and most importantly, the expiration of tariff waivers that had allowed Canadian firms to keep buying U.S. steel. The message was unmistakable: find new suppliers. Now. Canada wasn't just retaliating anymore, it was restructuring its economy. So where does the 12 billion figure come from? It's not a single stock crash, it's the value of exports put directly in the crosshairs. It's the cumulative damage of lost access, broken supply chains, and retaliatory cycles. It's the price of turning the world's most efficient industrial partnership into a battlefield. Wall Street saw clear winners and brutal losers. Steel producers thrived in their protected bubble. Everyone else absorbed the cost. Volatility surged, confidence fractured, uncertainty ruled. And now, as the dust settles, one question remains. Can this relationship be rebuilt, or has the damage gone too far? The USMCA review is approaching. The next chapter hasn't been written yet, but the ground is still smoldering. And what happens next will define the future of North American trade for decades.